Do you want to be able to edit hundreds of photos in minutes and not hours? Because in this video, I'm going to show you how I edit 201 photos in 15 minutes or less. All I've done so far to these photos is to import them and select a few of my favorites. So we have 201 photos here, and I've selected 25 different favorites from about 20 or so scenes. So you can see loads of different editing is going to be needed across each of these images. And the ability to be able to do this fast is a real game changer to your workflow and editing process, because it means less time behind your computer and more time shooting while still getting great results. So let's get started. Here are the 25 of my favorite photos from this trip. And I'm going to remove the selection here, and I'm in Library up here. And we're going to do a couple very drastic things here. We're going to edit all of these photos at once. The first thing I'll do is I'll go Command A or Control A if you're on a PC to select all photos. Then I'm going to go up to the top here, and I'm going to go to Photo, Develop Settings, and then Auto Settings. Or you can do Command or Control U. What this is going to do is it's going to automatically adjust the settings on every single photo for the exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, whites, blacks, the tone settings on these photos. Now, I consider these to be quite drastic changes, and I like to have the control myself. So I'm going to undo a lot of what's just been done there. The reason I'm doing this process is I want to have the exposure automatically done for me. When I'm shooting, I often shoot a stop or two over or underexposed. It's really the least of my worries when it comes to shooting photography. So with that in mind, I know that I'm going to have to go through these photos and adjust the exposure. So this is going to allow me to skip that step entirely. So let's say I open up one of these photos and I go over to the Develop panel here. You'll see all of these changes have been made. And what I want to do is I want to just keep this exposure adjustment. So I'm going to go back to the Library now. And while they're all selected, I'm going to apply one of my personal presets. I'll walk you through the preset in just a moment, but first let's select this. So all photos are selected. I'm going to go to Save Preset up here, and I'm going to go down to my one, which is down in User Presets, SIA Landscape. So that stands for Standard Initial Adjustments. The standard initial adjustments that I make to my photos. These are things that I typically change on every single photo, and they don't tend to be much different. That's why they're standard, and I put them across all of my photos before I start editing. One of the keys to maximizing your workflow is to have these initial adjustments saved as presets, so you can automatically do these 10% worth of changes to every single photograph before you even get started with your editing. So for me, when I edit a photo, about 80% of the editing process happens in the tone section, about 10% happens in these initial adjustments, and another 10 is going to be in some filters, brushes, and some of the, maybe the tone curve and the hue, saturation, luminance, the color section. So that's how we break it down. So this is covering the first 10%. The next thing we're going to look at is the other 80%, which is going to be the tone section for these images. So you'll see what's happening now as I open one of these photos up in the Develop panel. You'll see that everything except for the exposure was reset, and then my standard initial adjustment of clarity at 12 and dehaze at 11 is applied. So already I can select this photo and go ahead and click Preview Before, and you can see the differences that have been made to that photograph just by pressing a few buttons before I even get to the Develop panel. Let's go over and find a couple other photos to show you an example. So here's one of me at Petra at sunrise. And if I show you the original photo, you can see it's quite a big difference. But all I've had to do there is apply my standard adjustments and automatically adjust the exposure. Everything else I'm going to take for myself and make the adjustments manually. Let's dig a little bit deeper into what my standard initial adjustments mean for landscape photography. So we can see right at the top here, I've selected the profile of camera landscape. And this means that it's using the profile from my camera that is set to landscape. Usually when you open up Adobe, it will just be Adobe Color. And you can see this looks a little bit flatter. So as I move this off, you'll see it's a bit bolder. The colors have a stronger contrast by using the camera's Canon, the Canon preset for landscape photography. So that's what I prefer. I don't particularly like using the Adobe ones. This is something a lot of people miss, and we cover it in the course, as you'll probably well know by now. So that's something that we do very quickly at the beginning. That's applied to the photograph. The exposure is already done by that first thing we did, which was the Command or Control U, which does the exposure and the tone adjustments to all of the images. I add a little bit of clarity and dehaze. I don't do anything to the tone curve or the color section, but I do add some sharpening. So I set the sharpening to 100, which seems drastic, but remember I'm using a masking here. So I'm masking at 90. So if I was to just set this masking to 0, when I hold down the Alt key, you'll see that I'm processing the entire image. Anything that's white here is being processed with the sharpening. As I push it over to 90, you can see that just the outlines are being sharpened. So when you do this, you're allowed to push the sharpening a little bit further. If I push it to 100, you can see even less of the image is being sharpened. I'm quite happy that at 90, I'm only sharpening the outlines of my image. And then when I come through each of these photos individually, if I notice it's not sharp enough, I can then make more adjustments. If it's too sharp, I can make an adjustment too. But it's a great baseline here. I also remove chromatic aberration from the image, which you probably won't find in this scene, but it's good to have on because oftentimes you can't see it until you zoom in close and you might see it as an outline somewhere. So I keep that on. And I also enable profile corrections, which will correct some of the distortion from my 24-70 lens. You can see it's a big difference there. When you do turn on enable profile corrections, it removes some of the vignette from the lens. So I like to add a little bit of that back in. So I set a post-crop vignette at highlight priority to -10, and I get this result. So very basic initial adjustments, but it works for my style. As you start to develop your style as a photographer and a processor, you'll be able to make your own initial adjustments, which will allow you to speed up your processing too. Now that we've made these initial adjustments to my photos, we're about 30 seconds, 60 seconds into the processing process, and it's time to go through and manually edit each of these images, but we're going to do them in batches. So there's 201 photographs here, and after I imported them, I went through and I added a flag to all of the photos that I liked, and I did them in different scenes. So you'll see there's only a few here that are similar. Most of them are all in different scenes, and the reason for that is it allows me to find some of my favorites, and it allows me to find the different photos that I need to edit and then apply those edits across the similar photos in those groups. So here we have 25 different photos, which is quite a lot to do 25 different scenes fully processed in 15 minutes or less, but I assure you it's quite possible. So I'm going to go to this first photo now, and let's find the photo. I'm going to go over to the Develop tab here, and about 80% of the processing that's going to happen to this photo is going to happen with these 6 sliders. The exposure is pretty much set. We'll change the contrast, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. Before we do that, we need to turn on these clipping warnings up in the histogram, and then I can start making adjustments. So my personal style, the way I like to process and the way I recommend you process in the course, is to open up the dynamic range of the photo first so you can see what you have to work with and then edit from there. So I'm going to bring the highlights down and the shadows up, the whites up until we start to see clipping, and then the blacks down until we start to see clipping, and I think that's about fine there. I would also say we need to add a little bit of contrast, just a small amount, +10. And I think that the image is a little bit too warm, so I'm going to cool it down just slightly like that. And as I hit the before and after preview, we can see I haven't done much of a date change to this image. It was a very quick process, but I think it looks a lot better. I might bring down some of the clarity on this because there is a face in it, and clarity on a face doesn't look that great. You might also want to check the sharpening, but I don't think it's going to be that much of an issue here. Maybe push this to the right slightly. And then now that I have this edited, I can go to the other photos, and while I select the photo I've edited and put the other ones in the same selection, I can hit sync over here. But remember, before you check all and then hit synchronize, you need to undo the exposure setting, because Adobe Lightroom's already automatically set the exposure individually for every single image. So I don't want to undo that process. So I'm going to unselect exposure and then hit synchronize like so. And it's going to apply those settings to the other photographs. So you can see that we're probably going to have different exposure settings on each photo here. So the original one was -18, the next one's -4, but we have fully processed images with just a few clicks of a button. And you can see the before and after on this is quite significant, and I think the processed version looks a lot better. There are more things you can do to this image if you prefer, but this is my personal style and I'm happy like that. So that's one photo edited, but 3 other photos edited at the same time. And we're just going to copy this process throughout the whole of the album. Let's move on now to the next flagged photo. Here's a nice scene. I'm going to go through the same process again. I'm going to bring the highlights down, the shadows up, turn on the histogram warnings, the whites up, the blacks down, a little bit of contrast. The orange here looks a little bit green, so I'm going to go to the hue section for the yellow, and I'm going to bring this down. If I don't get what I want there, what I can do is I can reset that, use the tone selection tool here or the hue selection tool, and I can make this more orange like so. So I select the color I want to change. I think that looks really good. I can do the same up here. Keep that at blue, but maybe I want to make that blue a little bit darker. And let's turn off these exposure warnings. And the before and after on that is quite significant once again, and a very quick image to process. I'll go ahead and do the same thing again. I'll select all of them except exposure and synchronize. One more time, let's do this again. A beautiful scene, but a little bit underexposed, and that's because I gave priority over to the setting sun over here. So let's do that same process once again. I'm going to bring the highlights down, the shadows up, the whites up, let's turn the warnings back on, and the blacks down. The exposure I think needs to come up a little bit here, so Adobe didn't do a great job on this one, I don't think. And then I'm going to adjust probably the highlights up a little bit further, bring the exposure back down slightly. It's all a case of feeling out the image and getting an exposure that you're happy with. And I want to make those blacks a little bit stronger. Maybe some more dehaze because it is a hazy scene. And let's turn off these warnings now that we can see everything well. And I think that looks pretty good. Maybe I would bring the saturation of the yellow down a little bit. So I'll select this picker here and I'll go over to the orange. Just bring that down slightly because I think it is a bit overpowering for a desert scene like this. I think that looks a bit better. And maybe bring the blue down just to make it a little bit, maybe actually I think it looks better when we bring that up. Adds more contrast to the scene. So let's bring the blue up slightly. You can see the before and after, only a few clicks. Let's go through each of these photos now. I've selected that whole range. I'm selecting the photo I edited. Now this time I made an adjustment to exposure. I overdid what Adobe did. So when I hit sync settings, I'm going to include exposure in the synchronize settings. Hit synchronize. And now you can see that one in particular is quite beautiful, that these images are all processed. I would say these last three probably shouldn't have been grouped into that exposure setting. So maybe what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to the exposure, bring that down like so, and then synchronize these so that they're all about one stop underexposed now. And that's going to fix that. Here we are in Petra. So there's a number of different scenes and styles in these images, and I want to show you how I do them all differently as I go through. Here's Petra, and it's a beautiful scene. It's going to use some non-traditional editing, so probably less of the approach I've shown you here, just because it is nighttime photography, and there's a really, really strong orange in the scene. So here's a nice photo of us here, and let's start off with the highlights once again, and the shadows, bring out the shadows. The whites, don't want to push them too far, and the blacks. In a scene like this, I'm perfectly happy to have some black in the scene. I don't want this much black, but this here looks fine to me. We're allowed to have some black in this area. I would also probably bring the exposure down. And let's experiment with the hue of this orange as well. So this orange is quite red, and that's even more red. But if I push this up, we can maybe make it a little bit more yellow, just for an experimentation. I don't like this person over here. So before I make an adjustment to this person, I just want to see, are all of these photos shot in exactly the same position? And they're not. So before I do that, I've made that check so I can see, okay, well, before I make an adjustment, for example, I remove this person using a heal tool over here. I can make this a bit bigger. And I'm going to add a stronger vignette as well. Turn off these warnings now. Before I did that, I just wanted to make sure that I knew whether that person was going to be in every photo because that's going to change the way I sync the settings in these photographs. So I'm just going to probably add a little bit more exposure and contrast now that I've turned off those warnings. I think contrast is something we can really play with here. We do have some yellow up in the sky here, so let's bring down the saturation of that yellow like so. Makes it look it's not as dominant. I don't want to have light pollution, I want to have a white cloud. So I'm bringing that saturation down in the sky there, which I think looks pretty good. Now it is affecting the rest of the image. So if you don't like that, what you can do is you can leave it like there, go for a graduated filter across like so, and then I'm going to reset exposure and bring down the saturation of that part of the sky. And now it's just affecting that part of the sky and none of this foreground scene, like so. So I think that looks really cool. I'm going to now go across each of these images, select that image as the core photo, hit sync, and I'm not going to use the spot removal because that was when I removed that person from the corner. I don't want to do that to every image, so I'm going to go synchronize on each of these now. And if I need to go through and make adjustments and remove more people, I can do that quite quickly, but I don't want to do it without checking each image first. It's something I would probably never synchronize over. So I think that looks really cool. For the purpose of this video demonstration, I'm not going to show you the process of me editing every single photograph. What I will do though is I'm going to skip through and go for some more unique photographs. So for example, there's a photo here that I wanted to shoot in color so that I could process into black and white. So if I go to black and white and I select the camera matching monochrome, what that is unfortunately going to do is remove the option to adjust the colors in the photograph. So I'm going to go back up now and I'm going to go to Adobe black and white or Adobe monochrome here. We're going to select monochrome and you'll see down here we have a black and white mix to play with. So if you don't remember what the colors were, you can just reset, and I can see there's some orange and yellow and some green in this tree. So I'm going to take the green and I think we'll make it, well, actually it's really just the lens flare that's affecting, so I'll leave that alone. Let's take the yellow, make that nice and bright. We have blue here obviously, let's bring the blue, make it a bit darker so the tree pops out against it. We have a lot of orange down here. Could maybe make that just a little bit darker so we have more detail in the foreground. I'm also going to adjust highlights, shadows. That's cool to bring up those shadows like that. Some whites and blacks. And here, just very quickly, we've got a nice black and white photograph processed. And I'll synchronize that across both images like so. Again, turning off the exposure adjustment there. Because I like how that looks, I might try and apply that to some of my other photographs. So I'm now going to go through and synchronize the rest of them, leaving the exposure adjustment off, synchronize that, and we can have a look at what that looks like in a scene like this. I don't think it looks that great, but it's worth experimenting with. So I'll undo that, go back to one of these images, and you can process that manually. Let's skip forward to another image. So this one's also black and white. So let's say I edit this photo in black and white and I really like the style I have. I can copy this over to all of the other images in this whole album if I want, or I can do it selectively by syncing the settings, or while in the develop panel, I can go to Command or Control on a Windows PC, C for copy, and it's just like synchronize. It allows me to copy all of these settings. And then I can find the image I want and I can do Command or Control V and paste those settings, just like you were copying text in a Word document. You can copy the settings from the photos to another photo. So here's a really cool tree now that stands out as white against this black background. I think that looks great, and I'm really happy with that processing from that black and white image. I can apply that across the others using the sync tool now. And we're done. So here's an interesting one. This is the Milky Way. Milky Way processing is completely different. And in the course, you'll find one of the bonus walkthroughs is how we go through Milky Way processing. Because I've done a lot of Milky Way processing before, I have some presets saved. So this is from my Milky Way Mastery presets. I can find one that I like and apply it to the processing. So here, I think Yosemite Valley is going to look really good. I happen to know though that there is a graduated filter on this image, and I want to remove that because I think it looks way better when it's purple than when it's blue. And I can experiment a little bit further now with some of these blues. So let's say I want that blue to stand out a little bit more, purple out a little bit more, and maybe I even make the purple a little bit lighter for some contrast in that Milky Way. I also think a crop is probably something I want to apply to this image. So I'm going to bring this down and crop it to give more focus onto that Milky Way. And with that processing done, I can then synchronize those settings across all of those images. I like to do this just as a rough edit before I even get started by choosing my favorite photographs. Let's edit one more photograph together for good measure, and you can see just how fast this process can be. This was shot in Oman. You can see the standard initial adjustments have been applied and a small change to the exposure, but very minimal here. I'm going to turn on my exposure warnings on the histogram, bring the highlights down, the shadows up, the whites up and the blacks down, add in some contrast, maybe a little bit more dehaze just because we've got a lot of haze over here. And I can see that I am clipping a little bit with the blacks down here. So I'll bring the blacks up slightly, just like so. We can check it before and after here, so it's quite significant already. And I'm going to go down and make a couple of adjustments to the colors. So I see a lot of yellow in the scene and a lot of green as well. There's not much blue, but I see a little bit sticking out of the top of the frame here. So to make the clouds a little bit more contrasty and bold, I'm going to bring the blues down. Can't push it that far without changing how vibrant and vivid that color is going to be at the top. So I'm just going to bring it down to maybe -25 or so. Let's take the saturation of the green here and let's bring it up first of all just to see what it looks like. So it's going to be yellow and green, and I'm going to bring it down, and I think I'm going to bring it down and keep it down a little bit here because it allows me to have a slightly dustier view, which is the look I'm trying to achieve in this image. To keep in with the dusty feel of this image, I'm going to take this yellow here on this building and I'm going to make it a little bit more orange. So I'm selecting this yellow and I'm going to bring it down. So we push it a little bit towards the orange and the red section here. It just makes it a little bit dustier looking, and I think that looks really cool. I might actually just bring up the saturation slightly on the orange slider here. And I'm really happy with how that's come out. Perhaps I want to add slightly more vignetting to the image, but I don't think so. And maybe I want to crop it, but again, I'm not sure that I need to. I think that looks really cool, so I'm going to select all of the images, go back to the one I just edited, hit sync, and I'm going to synchronize. Now again, we don't need spot on, it can be on because we haven't made any changes here, but I don't select the exposure for the same reasons as explained earlier. And with the hit of a button, I'm going to synchronize my images, and now they're all processed the same way, and I'm really happy with this result. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out the links in the description below. I have an entire course on Lightroom processing that will show you how to take drab, ordinary, flat photographs and bring out all of the beautiful details that are hidden inside of them. It's an entire course on both Lightroom Classic and Lightroom CC, and you can check out a link in the video description below. And also, if you did enjoy this video, please consider subscribing. We're releasing new videos every week on a Monday at 12 PM GMT London time. So go ahead and click that subscribe button if you'd like to see more video content like this. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.